Hi, hello everyone. We will let a couple more people to join in and we'll start in a few seconds. Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. We're very happy to open yet another session of our virtual workshops, Policymaking in AI and Web3. Today, we would like to welcome you to the session on advancement in global AI policy. The session is co-hosted, and our workshop is co-hosted by the Getting Plurality Research Network at Harvard Kennedy School and the MIT Media Lab Connection Science team. Today's session will focus on reviewing advancement in global AI policy, and we will hear perspective from all over the globe, from the USA, from the UK, Latin America, and Africa. That's a very exceptional opportunity to hear in one place so many different approaches. The presentations today, we will have the benefit of hearing 5 presentations by 5 experts, 10 minutes each, and then we will have a Q&A session of 30 minutes, and we encourage you to please post your questions into the chat and along the conversation, and we will answer them at the Q&A session. I have the honor to introduce our speakers for today. The speakers, as I mentioned, are coming from diverse regional diversity. And we have Alex Pascal from the Harvard Kennedy School, who's going to speak about the Biden AI policy, past, present, and future. We are going to hear Andrew Streit from the Ada Lovelace Institute from the UK about the recent development in UK AI policy. We will then hear Chinasa Okolo from the Brookings Institute about Africa's role in international AI cooperation. We'll also hear Maya Levy-Daniel from University of San Andres and Wikimedia Argentina about AI regulation in Latin America and what's required in this process. Last but not least, we will hear Armando Guio-Espanol from the Harvard Berkman Center that will share his insight on generative AI. What should government in Latin America do? I would hand off the floor to my colleague Sarah to present the speakers, and thank you so much for the team that organized that, including Sarah, Robert, and the rest of the team. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Shlomi. Look forward to introducing our first speaker is Alex Pascal. Alex is a senior fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University and a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Alex has served for over a decade as a national security and domestic policymaker in the United States government, including 7 years at the White House. His current research focuses on governance and policy for artificial intelligence. I'll hand the mic over to you, Alex. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Shulamit, and it's great to be here. And thanks to the Getting Plurality Network and MIT Media Lab for organizing this and for having me. It's great to be here. I wanted to just take a few minutes and talk through sort of where did the Biden administration's executive order, sort of magnum opus executive order, and the Office of Management and Budget's use of AI in government memo come from. They rolled out about a month ago, and I think sort of blasted out with a lot of fanfare and were perceived to be very comprehensive. And so I think it's worth taking a step back to understand sort of where that all came from, what it actually did, and where we might be going from here. So the way that I sort of like to think about this, and having been involved in some of that work, is really sort of dividing it into two eras. There's the sort of pre-ChatGPT era and the post-ChatGPT era. And for lack of better terminology, I'm going to sort of leave it at that. But if there are better nomenclature to define the eras, I'd very much welcome that. But I think ChatGPT really was a sort of seminal moment in how the administration was thinking about, or not thinking about, but acting upon and sort of shaping policy on artificial intelligence. So the pre-ChatGPT era really does start actually in the Trump administration, and a number of actions by that administration, by Congress, to sort of set the stage for what the Biden administration did more recently. There's a sense, I think, in the Trump administration, sort of the mid 2010s and sort of the latter 2010s, that sort of AI is coming. There's a sense that something's happening out there. Government should get ready. There's a vague sense that we're going to have to deal with AI eventually, but this isn't sort of a pressing concern right now. There's not a seminal moment right now. But yet people are starting to get this sort of sense that sort of AI is getting better. It's going to start affecting the way that we work and think and make policy and sort of how it shapes the world. And so a number of actors, including the federal government, start to put some of the pieces in place to begin dealing with this. And in this era, there's the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which defines artificial intelligence for the first time. This is still the definition that the U.S. government uses, by the way, and it, in part because it's too fraught an issue to revisit, and nobody really wants to redefine AI, so they just keep going back to that NDAA definition. There's the 2020 National AI Initiative Act, which creates an AI office in the White House, in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and creates a National AI Advisory Committee to start getting a grip on what are the implications of this technology, how is it going to sort of affect the way that government operates, and what policies might be needed to address it. And then there's the 2020 AI and Government Act, which creates an AI Center of Excellence in the General Services Administration to help other government agencies understand how best to use AI. It directs the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to do a guidance memo for how the federal government should use AI. And that came out almost 3 years later, last October, or this past October. And finally, it directed the Office of Personnel Management to update its hiring guidelines to make it a little bit easier to hire AI talent into the government. And there's a sense that, again, we need to get ready for this thing, but it's not quite here yet. I would also add that I think the Department of Defense and the intelligence community have been ahead of the game more or less the whole way. And I think that derives from a sense that AI is going to provide both a military and intelligence edge to the U.S. government if we can harness it, as well as a sense that there's China in particular, but other countries are trying to harness it, and that could pose a threat to U.S. national security. And so I think the national security establishment has been further ahead in thinking about how to integrate AI into its systems and doctrines and behaviors, and well as putting some guardrails and some principles around how to use it ethically. So Congress did a bunch, but the Trump administration actually, in its last days, issued an executive order on trustworthy AI in January 2020, right before the transition. And this established a number of actually very good principles for the use of AI in the U.S. government. And it directed a use case inventory of how federal agencies are using AI now. This was never really done, but you could see sort of the tasking was re-upped in the Biden administration's executive order. And I think people continue to think that was a good idea to understand just how the federal government was using AI as a way to understand how it should be using it moving forward. So fast forward, January 2021, the Biden administration comes into office, and tech was really not on the sort of in the sort of top pantheon of policy issues. There was COVID, there was economic freefall, there was January 6th, and tech policy, was, I think, noted as important, but something we will get to later. So, a bunch of work is done sort of under the radar, and eventually in 2022, the administration comes out with what it calls its tech accountability principles. And these are key principles for how the administration will approach big tech in particular, but also sort of platforms and the platform economy more generally. Some of these principles include sort of promoting competition and avoiding concentrations of economic power, protecting kids, non-discrimination, Section 230 reform. And these principles really were informed by, I think, the social media era and sort of the social media hangover and some of the platform harms of the last decade. There was also the establishment of a policy process by the Domestic Policy Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, something that I co-led, called the AI and Equity, IPC, which was a multi-agency effort to use federal tools to make AI more and shape AI into a more equitable and fair technology and ensure that its use was advancing civil rights and protecting people's rights. In October of 2022, after a year of work, the administration issues what's called the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and a number of federal actions to address algorithmic discrimination. Now, this came out with not a ton of fanfare at the time. It's since gotten a lot more attention, in part because of when it rolled out. But this was a non-binding set of principles and expectations and sort of a little bit of a roadmap for how a variety of actors, the federal government, state governments, private sector actors, citizens, civil society, could and should use and interact with automated systems, including advanced AI. And the fundamental sort of driving force behind this document was that technology, artificial intelligence included, but technology broadly speaking should be quote unquote rights respecting. That is, the rights and sort of liberties of people should be respected regardless of what the technology is. And this document was really focused on protecting Americans' rights in the AI era. So that came out a few weeks before ChatGPT rolled out, and I think seized the public's attention, seized policymakers' attention, and certainly the business community as well. And this is sort of the advent, or at least the recognition that generative AI, the era of generative AI is here, and machine learning has resulted in something truly sort of potentially transformative and sort of something that can engage with the public in a different kind of way. So the public seems to be both enthralled by ChatGPT and also a little freaked out. And there's a sense within the administration, I think in early 2023, that this technology could be transformative. It could exacerbate the harms and threats that we already have. It carries new risks. There's a sense that this was a huge moment and the administration did need to ask. And I would add that part of the sense that this was transformative was not just a public reaction, but conversations with the AI labs themselves saying that these things really do carry new risks and new harms. And we're a little bit worried and freaked out about what they could potentially do. So we really want your help, federal government, in establishing some guardrails and helping us work through some of these challenges. So it was both the inside and the outside, I think, sense of heightened risk that I think stimulated the government to begin a more turbocharged effort at dealing with AI. So the Biden administration recognizes that this is a bit of a seminal moment. There's also, I think, an acknowledgement that new federal policymaking would take time, that legislation by Congress was unlikely anytime soon, and ultimately that the private sector and the labs themselves were the pace setter in all of this, that their deployment, their development of the technology was going to drive the pace and at which the rest of society was going to have to deal with this. But the administration wasn't, having to sit on its hands. There were a number of things that I think the Biden administration knew it could do. One was shape the AI lab's behavior in two dimensions. By shaping the public narrative and announcing a policy approach, and by securing private sector commitments to behave in particular ways. So the administration began a number of communications efforts to begin to shape the public narrative about what responsible innovation in AI should be. And you can see this reflected in the president's remarks and some of the public comments by administration officials that AI needs to be safe before it is released into the public. We need to make sure this is safe, that people's rights are respected before this is deployed. And I think this reflects a sense of the lessons learned from social media where, policymakers more or less sat on their hands for a decade while the platforms kind of did what they wanted. And there were real benefits, but I think also a recognition that there were real harms over time. So the goal was to put the public onus on the companies to be responsible. The administration also convened CEOs in the spring and secured a number of voluntary commitments for how the sort of major platforms and the major AI labs would behave and in terms of innovating and rolling out their technologies. And this recognizes that the labs themselves were in the driver's seat on innovation, and have the responsibility, but they themselves could act faster than the government could. The government also initiated processes to develop the executive order that we saw come up. There was also work done in the Executive Order 14091 on further advancing equity to add non-discrimination, civil rights, and equity as one of the core principles for governing how AI should operate within the government and beyond. And then there's the Biden administration's executive order, which was the most, as far as I can tell, the most comprehensive EO ever, and had a number of threats reflecting a number of harm mitigation principles and sets of steps, sort of organizing principles to govern the work, ranging from national security to protecting workers, educators, consumers, and marginalized communities, promoting competition, advancing privacy, and attracting and retaining AI talent. The OMB memo sort of furthered that work and continued to try to build on how the U.S. government should handle and use AI systems and procure them, and to shape the private sector by establishing a sort of benchmark set of best practices for how the federal government would use AI and what it would require in order for the government to buy AI from the private sector. So where do we go from here? We now have the EO, we have the OMB memo, but those don't actually do the work. What they do is direct the work to be done. And so what I think we're going to see over the next sort of 60 days to 18 months is a whole flurry of best practices and guidelines and guidance by the federal government that they will hope will shape the private sector's behavior. But this is really the beginning of the work, not the end. I think the key questions here are a few. One is, does the government actually have the human capacity to do this work well? It is not clear that the understanding and the talent, the AI talent and the understanding of the technology and its implications, there's enough of that in the government to do this work on the timeline that the EO sets out. And so I think that's why you see a huge focus on talent acquisition. There's also, I think, an expectation that independent agencies like the FTC and the CFPB will do a bunch of rulemaking and take actions within their domains and try to shape the private sector's behavior that way. But this could take months or years. It remains to be seen whether Congress will act. There's a number of bills out there, and I think that sort of the driver is really Chuck Schumer in the Senate here. I'm skeptical legislation will come. It's possible that next year on something bipartisan is possible, but I'm not holding my breath on Congress. I think the key substantive questions to be answered by Congress are how to regulate foundation models in frontier AI, where does liability for harm lie, and what to do about open source or unsecured models. The other places to watch in this space while Congress deliberates is what the US states are doing, and a number of states have introduced and passed AI-related legislation. It tends to be narrower and not sort of comprehensive, but there's been work on data privacy, AI research, banning discrimination and surveillance through AI, and deepfakes in politics and political advertising. The other space to watch is the courts, and whether litigation by attorneys general and individuals for harms will be litigated through the courts, and the courts will establish the boundaries of liability and who's liable for what. And I think that will do a lot to shape how innovation in advanced AI takes place in the United States moving forward. Okay, I've already taken too long, so I'm going to hand it back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Alex. Next, I would like to introduce Andrew Strait. Andrew is an associate director at the Ada Lovelace Institute and is responsible for Ada's work addressing emerging technology and industry practice. Andrew spent the last decade working at the intersection of technology, law, and society. Prior to joining Ada, he was an ethics and policy researcher at DeepMind, where he managed internal AI ethics initiatives and oversaw the company's network of external partnerships. And previously, he also worked as a legal operations specialist at Google. Now we'll hand it over to you, Andrew. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much for having me here. I'm very excited to have a chat with you all about the UK's AI policy developments lately. As you can probably tell from my accent, I am not British. I am married to a British person. I am on my way to citizenship. So if I make any faux pas, if I don't include the right amount of yous in any of my words, please forgive me. I'm learning as I go. Just to give some background, I think it's helpful to start a bit about the sort of patchwork of existing regulation and sort of voluntary principles that already exist around AI and have been sort of operating for quite some time. So probably about 6 years ago, we started to see the very first forms of sort of horizontal proposals around things like human rights or data protection and equalities frameworks around that affected AI and data. But we also start to see some more vertical approaches. So, for example, our MHRA, our medical device regulators approach towards regulating software as a medical device and specifically software that had medical in it, AI in it. We've also seen an array of different kinds of guidance from civil society organizations, from government, from industry organizations, or from labs like the BBC or the NHS about how they're using AI and about the principles that they follow, and some work at the Turing Institute to develop a standards hub to create sort of some feed-in for a wider group of experts into the domestic standards approach. But for quite some time, it's been a very fragmented patchwork of regulation and approaches around AI and data. There hasn't been a lot of join up. And one of the things this government has been trying to work on is essentially how do we create a bit more of a comprehensive framework? It's also safe to say the UK public wants regulation. We do a lot of public attitudes and public engagement exercises in our organization's work. Regulation comes up almost every single time. It's sort of a recurring theme amongst projects, even when we don't ask about governance or regulation. There's very low trust in industry at the moment in the UK in developing and regulating AI-driven technologies compared to other stakeholders. And there's a lot of appeal for modes of explainability, modes of redress, particularly for AI technologies that affect high impact settings, things like loan allocation or the delivery of public services. And a recurring theme we also see in our work is that members of the public also really ask for a lot more agency, control, and choice in where AI is used, as well as processes of consent and opt-in for sharing of data. That's particularly true in the health context, where we've had some very notable moments of mass opt-outs of sharing of data in the NHS when the NHS has tried to make that process a bit easier and a bit more simpler. So the government for the last few years has been trying to sort of come up with this more comprehensive regime. It's come up with an AI white paper for regulation, which sort of sets out its approach. But before I talk about that, I think it's helpful to talk about 3 documents that kind of led into that. The first is the Hall Report, which established an AI Advisory Council in 2017. This is a group of experts who advise the governments on developments around AI policy, AI trajectory, and how they can think about sort of governance approaches. This body, unfortunately, was disbanded about 6 months ago. There's a whole story behind that, but I'm going to hold on that for now. But just to say, it's sort of one of the things that's been a bit tricky about this kind of new pivot in recent months around how the UK government is approaching AI governance. The second is its AI strategy, which was a sort of a redone version of the 2018 strategy. This came out in 2021. It focused on 3 kind of core areas. One was the use of AI in the public sector and some kind of common challenges around AI for climate or AI for health. It also looked at development of skills and compute infrastructure, heavy investments in master's and PhD programs to really lean into the UK's sort of strong academic institutions. And then lastly, it had a section on governance, which covers a few things. One is an organization that the UK created in 2018 called the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which developed an AI assurance framework. This is, again, sort of a voluntary set of policies or principles that allow for end-to-end accountability of AI systems. It includes proposals for auditing, for transparency assessments, for documentation, for impact assessments before a product goes to market. And this was sort of a centerpiece of the national AI strategy in terms of calling for more governance. It also includes some references to the use of standards. So again, really leaning into the UK playing this role of fitting in with a wider international standards ecosystem and how they can support standards, particularly around governance of AI technologies. And then the third thing that kind of led into this was establishing a pro-innovation approach to regulating AI. This was a sort of government document released in 2022 that established this pro-innovation mindsets that they're taking towards AI regulation. And what the kind of framework for the white paper gets at, and what this previous document discusses, is really this mindset of minimizing unnecessary burdens on business as kind of the starting point for how they're thinking about any kind of regulation. This extends beyond AI. It also touches a bit on how they're thinking about data protection, which I'll cover in just a minute. But just to say that the framing that they've taken is to try to do sort of a light touch approach as much as they can, and to really lean into existing sector-specific regulation and regulators. Tactically, I would say that part of the reason for this at the time of 2021 was to try to drive a wedge between a very heavily regulated EU that had sort of its Digital Markets Act and EU AI Act in proposal, and then the seemingly laissez-faire United States, which it sort of offered this opportunity to kind of add sort of a, we're not as heavily regulated as the EU, but you can still kind of get some governance here and really appeal to US businesses as a way to kind of land their offices here in the UK. I really want to stress that has changed significantly in the last 6 months. That the US is, with its executive order, has kind of taken a bit more of a European sort of positioning in terms of its approach to AI governance. And that has had some really interesting knock-on effects about how the government is now thinking about its response around this proposed white paper and regulation. But broadly, what it covers is sector-specific regulation. It focused on 5 principles that would sort of sit cross-sectorally so that all regulators would have to follow them around AI. These are safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency, explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, contestability and redress. There is some central functions to support regulators. One is the central AI risk function, which will be responsible for monitoring and assessing for different kinds of AI risk. Also, I think what they're really trying to get at is sort of monitoring for systemic kinds of risk, so impacts on information environments or other kinds of safety critical catastrophic risk. The other thing that's really, I think, a really impressive strength of the United Kingdom and its approach to regulation is it does have some existing cross-regulatory bodies, like the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is 5 of our largest regulators that are joined up around digital regulation issues. There's also a Digital Markets Unit, which is the our Information Commissioner, our Competition Markets Authority, and I believe Ofcom, if I'm not mistaken. I can tell there's some people from FCA here, so please give me a shout if I've got that completely wrong. Essentially, it's another attempt to kind of join up efforts around how to investigate and assess for different kinds of digital markets and regulatory issues. There's, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of non-regulatory tools around standards and these kind of voluntary assurance frameworks, which also will feature a part of this forthcoming UK approach. There's some other factors at play as well around AI and data regulation. One is data protection and the Digital Information Bill, which is the UK's amended UK GDPR. It has some quite significant changes, both in terms of the role of the ICO, our data protection regulator, as well as some exemptions that might risk inadequacy with EU GDPR. These include things like a much bigger carve out for scientific research, which essentially kind of blurs the lines between uses of data for scientific research and for sort of industry purposes. There's also the Alien Safety Bill, which the government passed this fall. This empowers Ofcom to have new powers to assess platform moderation policies and create some design codes for online platforms. It's sort of a slightly different tack than the EU's Digital Services Act in that it's more for sort of around trying to assess platforms as holding to their own platform moderation policies rather than just creating more transparency and testing. There's the Frontier AI Task Force. This was also launched, sort of modeled the COVID-19 vaccine task force and led by Ian Hogarth. It had, essentially is now been turned into our AI Safety Institute as a sort of permanent body that's within our Department for Science, Information and Technology. And that body essentially is the remit to develop evaluations and tests for frontier models as a way to sort of assess their kinds of assess their suitability and safety for different kinds of risks. And as many of you know, we did have a global AI safety summit in Bletchley Park in November, which brought together a number of key companies, countries, and researchers to sort of discuss a range of AI safety issues. So about that safety summit, what a wild time that was. What we expected going in, I think in the months which it was announced, it was a very tight timeline. I think the government gave themselves 10 weeks to get this all pulled together and organized. Initially, there were some proposals for a very narrow focus on sort of 2 types of existential risk, and then very narrowly focusing on this very poorly defined concept of frontier AI, which essentially in early definitions was basically any AI system that's more powerful, depending on how you define more powerful, and that's not here yet. There was also calls in the Leap to the Summit for an IPCC for an AI, so some kind of intergovernmental scientific body that would have the ability to gain access to models and data from large foundation model providers and assess them for different kinds of risks. And then voluntary policies for frontier model providers. This was, again, building on the G7 commitments that came out of Hiroshima and the White House commitments to establish some kind of voluntary protocols for things like use of data, responsible capability scaling policies, testing and evaluation policies, and post-monitoring obligations. So what do we get? Well, we got a wonderful fireside chats, one could call it, between our Prime Minister and Elon Musk. That was certainly something, but we also got quite a lot of other things. One was a broader focus by the end of the summit on a bunch of different kinds of risks, which includes some that are more socio-technical. So the ways in which AI systems can just malfunction or go wrong or create all kinds of unforeseen harms and accidental harms. There was the creation, instead of a international body, 2 national AI safety institutes in the UK and the US. We had voluntary policies for frontier model providers that occurred. We had the US executive order on AI, which was very interestingly timed on the first day of the summit, with Vice President Harris giving a barnstorming speech at the embassy. And then we had the announcement of 2 more AI safety summits in Korea and France in the next year, and the signing of the Bloodshed Declaration, which essentially established a commitment for continuing negotiations and discussion around AI safety issues. Critically, one of the things that I think was very notable in the UK's response was, despite public statements from our Prime Minister and from our Secretary of State about the importance of acting now and acting quickly to address future AI risks, there was no commitment made to UK regulation for AI. And that's very important because essentially, I won't get into the details about how the parliamentary schedule works. If they were not going to be able to put a bill in before the beginning of December, essentially it's not going to happen. So what this means is that because they weren't able to get a bill before Parliament in the next session, we likely won't see a bill at the earliest until 2026 2025 after the next election, which is supposedly going to be the end of 2024. One of the things that we've looked at is just looking at this patchwork, looking at the existing government approach and the sector-specific approach to regulation. How well are people currently protected? And one of the projects we did was that we commissioned a law firm called AWO to essentially run a legal analysis looking at cross-regulatory impacts of different kinds of hypothetical AI systems that are causing certain kinds of harms to consumers or people. So one of these systems was an automated employment tool used by a supermarket chain. Again, this is very hypothetical. Please don't sue me if you're from Tesco or from Sainsbury's. And this tool hypothetically can allocate shifts to warehouse workers, set variable levels of pay, infer information about candidates during the hiring process. It was leading to, hypothetically, all kinds of harms around reduction of working conditions, inaccurate references for applicants, you name it. And our analysis showed that just a lot of the legal requirements are just very limited in terms of ensuring the decision maker considers these types of harms in advance. It's unlikely that a regulator would be able to prevent this kind of harm through enforcement of those requirements. It's very impractical to suggest that any individual might be able to have rights of redress for these kinds of systems. And it just really highlights, again, some of the issues and gaps that we see at the moment in terms of the existing sector-specific law that's currently on the books. We did do one in biometric mortgage assessment, which was a bit more rosy. This was a tool that involved a lender maybe using applicants to undertake a video interview and sort of scoring them based on their performance. But I think a more interesting one, just because, funnily enough, complete coincidence, the government has now chosen to create this exact system, is a Department of Work and Pensions chatbots that can provide advice to recipients on universal credits, or social welfare payments, replacing phone-based customer service. So hypothetically, if the system were to lower pay or shifts or termination or create, wrong harms. If the system were to discriminate against people in any sort of way or create any kind of sort of mistakes or kinds of modes of redress issues, at the moment, there's just very inadequate protections for any kind of ex-ante assessment or evaluation or the ability for individuals to find out evidence about that harm beforehand. There are some modes of redress that exist at the moment in the current scheme, but as we talk about in the paper, some of those also have some problems that are more practical, even though they look like they're okay on paper. So what we kind of conclude from this analysis is that it's just not realistic for regulators like the ICO or the Equality and Human Rights Commission as cross-cutting regulators to enforce UK GDPR and the Equality Act with a completeness that will reliably protect against the kinds of harms that AI systems can raise. They don't have sufficient powers, resources, or sources of information, and they have not always made full use of the powers that they have already. So one question that we then are hoping to end on is just how do we improve those kinds of protections and looking forward. So at ADA, we've thought about 3 tests for AI regulation. One is coverage. This is looking at this question of where are the gaps around sector-specific regulation, what kinds of issues are missing, what kinds of monitoring capabilities are needed, and how do we ensure that regulators are identifying and spotting those. Another is capability. So that's really about resources and skills. Some regulators are extremely well-resourced. I would include the FCA in this. Others in the UK, like the EHRC, are horrendously under-resourced. They just don't have enough staff and skills in-house to conduct these kinds of evaluations. And then another is urgency. So this is really the notion about both having the powers in order to conduct these kinds of audits and assessments and necessary, which seems like many don't, but also the ability to do this very quickly. I'm going to end there, but just to share a couple links to some of the documents that we have written about these topics in case they're of interest, and happy to talk about any of them in the Q&A. Thanks so much, and back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Andrew. And we can also circulate some of those afterwards with the participants. Next, I'd love to welcome Maya. Maya Levy-Daniel is a tech policy and regulation specialist. She is currently an independent consultant, research associate at the Center for Technology and Society at the University of San Andres in Argentina, and a public policy advisor at Wikimedia Argentina. Maya has worked across various sectors and has written extensively on issues around artificial intelligence governance and digital platform regulations. Welcome, Maya. I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for having me today. I'm very glad to be here since, well, I love discussing these issues, and I also think that it's a great time to have this kind of conversations and what's happening in different parts of the world. So we are able to compare the different approaches. So for this around 10 minutes, I'd like to start with a brief overview of the current regulatory scenario in Latin America. And based on this overview, then discuss a few key points regarding the region in particular, and also some recommendations. So to start with, in Latin America, there are countries that are in different stages of regulatory development. So there's a first group of countries that already have their AI strategies and action plans. And in this group, we can find Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, for instance. And we also have some countries in some gray areas. For instance, we have Argentina that has published its AI strategy, but it was never officially approved. And the interesting thing here was that the strategy was published at the end of an administration and then was discarded by the following one. I remember I interviewed members of the new administration for a project, and they didn't even know that the strategy existed. So there's a problem there. And in the second group, there are countries in the region that already have their AI strategies and are currently willing to regulate. So we have Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and Costa Rica, for instance. And they are discussing a few bills each. And in the case of Chile and Brazil, for instance, the bills that are currently under discussion follow the same approach as the one in the EU AI Act. So they are also based on the types of risks. And some countries have also published other types of documents. For instance, Colombia has developed and published its ethic principles. Argentina also has some recommendations for a trustworthy AI in the public sector. And many countries in the region have joined the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, as well as the OECD principles. And also in October this year, a group of countries have joined the Declaration of Santiago, by which this group of countries, among other things, agreed to keep the dialogue on AI going and to set up a working group on AI. So this is a very brief overview of the Latin American regulatory situation nowadays. So we have countries that are at different regulatory stages. And the region is still working on an agreement about the use of AI and shared objectives regarding its implementation. But the main question is, what should the approach to AI regulation in Latin America be? And we don't have a concrete answer to this question, but we know that countries are already translating the EU AI Act approach into Latin American bills, for instance, the cases of Chile and Brazil. We also know that this had already happened in other fields. For instance, with the GDPR, a great number of Latin American countries have passed personal data protection laws that were developed after the GDPR was passed and were based on it. But this happened in general a few years after the GDPR had been passed. So in the case of AI, we can't even know how the EU AI Act will work in the EU whenever it is approved. So it's difficult to determine if this framework would work in Latin America. And also there are differences between the EU or the US and Latin America. For instance, among other things, those developing AI systems are usually not very large companies, but are startups or small and medium enterprises. And this is a huge difference. So based on these developments and the regulatory scenario, there are a few key points and recommendations I'd like to make. So first, it would be crucial to take the necessary time to ask why we would need regulation in a specific country, and particularly define the problem we are willing to address. So after seeing how some non-binding initiatives worked in general, I think we currently agree that regulations on AI may be necessary, but we need to define the specific problem we are addressing in each particular case, because the issue we need to focus on may vary in each region and each country. And in order to do this, we need to understand the context and the available resources we have and develop a shared baseline. So we need to ask who the main actors are, what are the types of companies we are addressing, what types of services we are targeting, and how are both the private and the public sectors implementing AI. So a mapping would be a very good exercise, for instance, to do before starting to design any policy or regulation. And some key questions will be, who is developing AI in the country and how? What are the main risks in each particular country? How are developments from abroad impacting this country in particular? And depending on the type of AI systems and entities and the risks that are involved, there should be different types of obligations. Otherwise, regulations could end up having unintended consequences, such as stifling innovation and establishing barriers, particularly for small companies. And this mapping should also include the different laws and regulations already in place. So regulations on AI should take into account other relevant laws and policies, such as those related to personal data protections, or for instance, digital platform regulations. In Latin America, for instance, most of the countries already have their own personal data protection laws, and this should be taken into account. So we need to be very careful not to copy and paste initiatives from abroad and hurry regulation, because this takes time. And we know this is already happening in the region, as I mentioned, with the EU AI Act and also with the DSA. But we don't know how these models will work in the EU and how they can work in other countries. So we should consider the specific context in each case. And Latin America is not a monolithic entity, because we talk about Latin America, but as a whole, but there are differences between countries regarding the maturity of democracies, their resources and economic contexts, and respect for fundamental rights. And also with regards to their stages of development around AI policies and guidelines, and each country's needs will depend on what has already been developed.